leave your tablet open to the ACA website or with a video of that's kind of awkward.
You don't want folks to see your browser history.
Yes.
No.
I don't even want you to see the other tabs I currently have open right now. But, on that note, we're gonna go to Jason in Fairbanks, Alaska, who helped us out pre-show to make sure that the phones were working. Thanks for waiting, Jason.
Hi. Thank you.
Although wait, did you change your topic? Or did I change people?
I accidentally got hung up on, or maybe my phone hiccuped or whatever, and I called back and I probably stated it slightly differently.
Yeah, because before it said something about uncertainty, and now it says something about non-hypothesis. Anyway,
let's tell the audience what it is.
Okay.
Go ahead,
I wanted to talk to Matt about the null hypothesis when it comes to historicity of, well, Jesus specifically, but just generally, because I think what I've heard Matt say before is that the null hypothesis is that we assume a character is real until proven otherwise, and that feels backwards to me.
So what I've said is that's the way historians generally operate, that if someone is written about and spoken about as if they were a real person, if there aren't the hallmarks there of fiction or that we just go with the assumption that this was probably a real person. That's just a matter of kind of necessity, practicality for historians. It doesn't mean that they just de facto assume that everybody they hear about lived. And it's problematic, too, because if you go with the general view of history, or the way historians tend to work, it's, okay, Jesus is being spoken about as if he actually existed, so we'll run with that assumption, essentially.
So outside the specialized domain of historians, what would be the null hypothesis? What does that mean, and what would that look like for the general case?
So I did a video on null hypothesis, so that's probably quicker and easier than trying to do it here. But essentially, it is the hypothesis to be disproven, essentially, to establish a position. My view of this, when it comes to the historical Jesus, I have no problem with the notion that there may be a real person at some level, behind the stories. But I don't think it's been established that the person existed, and certainly hasn't been established that we have an accurate record of his words and deeds, or that the miracles that supposedly happened, we don't have evidence for those things actually happening.
Okay. I mean, yeah. So I guess, because it just seems to me like, and I only got a BA or a BS actually, because the University of Oregon does that. I got a BS in history, and I don't know that I would assume a character is historical just because everyone else does. That just seems like, because I don't understand how you could have proof that something is not historical, right? Like, how would you go about proving, for instance, that Hercules is non-historical?
Sure.
Like there isn't some character that
it doesn't matter.
Heavily fictionalized.
So it doesn't matter. Here's the thing. It's not up to us to prove that Hercules didn't exist. The burden of proof is on the people who are saying that he did exist. And by and large, if you look at the way things are written about, Hercules is written about only in the context of, miraculous, supernatural, heroic story things. And so it could be the case that there was a Hercules, but if you list all of the things that are claimed about Hercules and get rid of all the things that we can't prove, there's pretty much nothing left. Same for Jesus. If you get rid of all the things that we cannot confirm, there's nothing left. So this is why I say I have no problem with the notion that there may have been an actual person at the foundation of this, but we know virtually nothing about them. So when the assumption, and I'm not saying that all historians by and large do this, there's a process by which you read something and from the surrounding context, Harry Potter doesn't exist. We have a history of Harry Potter being an intentionally created fiction. Now, it could be that entire universe is real and J.K. Rowling has been tapping into that universe and relaying stories to us, but that is at the preposterous level where somebody would have to work ages to sort that out.
It sounds like, though, your advice is not to worry so much about the person, but worry about the claims about that person.
Because here's the thing. Either Jesus existed or he didn't. If we assume that he existed, what then do we get? Well, that we don't get to assume that he raised the dead or healed the sick. Those are all actions that would need their own supporting evidence. It's just like, in 1,000 years, somebody could assume that I existed and was a real person because we've lost all footage of everything I've ever done or said. But if there's a story that I flapped my wings and flew to the moon and came back with gold rocks and green cheese, that requires its own evidence. And the fact that somebody would be correct in assuming that I existed doesn't mean that they're correct in any other assumptions about me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess it does. It just, I don't know. Still feels a little bit like there's maybe a special pleading going on with Jesus because there are so many people who already believe that he's a real character that they're just assuming it because of the belief and then believing it because everyone assumes it.
Yeah, well, but if there was a itinerant rabbi running around at the beginning of the first millennia, so what?
Yeah, and if somebody believes that Jesus actually existed, that's separate from what they believe about what he did. So I could grant Jesus actually existed, and we're still nowhere near Christianity. I can even grant that we have an accurate recording of his words, and we're still nowhere near establishing Christianity. I could even, and this is a bit of a stretch, accept that he did some of the things that are reported that we don't have explanations for, and it would still not get us to Christianity because we don't get to presume an explanation. How did Jesus turn that water into wine? Was he a prestidigitator? Was it some kind of trick? Did he have some,
threw some money at the problem?
Yeah. Did he have a food replicator? Or we don't know. So it's not hypocritical for somebody to say, you know what? Because this person has been talked about so much as if they were a real person, I'm fine with the notion they existed. There's nothing hypocritical about that because they're not necessarily asserting certainty about that claim. And at the end of the day, it's ultimately an untestifiable and unfalsifiable claim because I don't have a time machine. I don't know how I would prove that Jesus didn't exist, which is probably my biggest gripe with some of the mythicists. Now, they can make a case that it's more reasonable than not to consider Jesus a myth, and I think they're right when you take into consideration all the things that are claimed about Jesus. I just don't think that there's a justification to reach the conclusion, Jesus never existed. I can't get there.
Well, you boil it down, there's precious little there.
Yeah.
But we did do that with a formerly accepted quote-unquote historical character with Moses, right? That's exactly what happened. Was eventually got to the point where the community said, all right, nope, didn't exist.
No. If there's somebody out there who's saying, okay, Moses didn't exist, I fundamentally disagree with them. I don't know how you can establish that Moses did not exist. My position on Moses is I have no idea if he existed or not. How would what would be the reason to say that there was not a person who was a leader of a group of people that we have stories about?
Okay. I guess I misunderstood some of the things that I've heard you and Richard, Dr. Carrier talk about.
Oh, Richard and I disagree.
Okay. Well, because my understanding was that the community consensus now is that Moses is most likely a fictional character.
Yeah, I think that's preposterous that you could say that that's a consensus position, given the predominance of Jews and Christians who are likely to believe that. You may say that it's a common position amongst historians, but I would then question their methodology, which is, how did you falsify this?
Okay.
Well, I think this is another case of you got to look at the particular stories. For someone to have lived that long, no. For somebody to have written about their own death, no. Somebody wandering
the writing
years
about
in
their
the
own
desert,
death thing is
I
don't think so.
Not anyone this side of a Highlander, maybe.
The only thing they're writing about the own death thing, it just shows that Moses didn't write that particular passage, which is not that remarkable to me. That somebody could have lived and written stuff, and then somebody came along and was like, "I'm going to finish Moses' work by saying, and Moses died here." But it could just be that the assumption that Moses was the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament is just wrong. that there are other authors, and yet Moses may have existed independently. But at the end of the day, and this is why it frustrates me so much, there's no way that I'm aware of to realistically, to a strong degree of confidence, demonstrate that Moses or Jesus actually existed, or to demonstrate that they actually did not exist. It's just one of those things, and neither position gets us anything. It could be entirely reasonable for me to think that they both existed, but we don't know much about them. And it could be entirely reasonable for me or anybody else to say, you know what, given the fact that here's 100 things attributed to Moses, and 99 of them are fables and stuff that has no evidentiary support, that we can just throw it all out. My only objection is to throwing out the one. Because we know we make up stories about people and we exaggerate. Is it reasonable to conclude that Moses never existed? Yeah, it may in fact be. I think it may be a case. It's just I don't know how you would claim that this is the case rather than it's reasonable. You could reasonably come down on either side of this.
So you're an agnostic.
I suppose that's why I feel like the null hypothesis should be that he doesn't exist, because if he did exist, then the potential exists for there to be some proof that he existed.
Sure.
Right?
But, okay.
In the same way that Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great definitely existed, because we can show evidence that they existed.
Yes, that's the case for some figures in history. It's not the case for all figures in history. There are clearly people who existed who we know nothing about.
Right.
And there are people who may have existed, and all the things that we know about them are not true. So you have to distinguish between, was there a person at the center of the story and the stories blew up, or was there no person at the center of the story and the stories blew up? Was Paul Bunyan a real person? Was King Arthur a real person? What about the relationship between Plato and Socrates? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether or not Socrates existed for me to evaluate what is attributed to him and evaluate those sayings on their own merits. And the same thing's true for Jesus. I can go through the Sermon on the Mount, and I have, and it doesn't matter whether Jesus existed or said it. I can evaluate those things based on what he said or what he's claimed he said. Yeah, my only issue with the mythicists is that some of them, I think, go a step too far. And some of them, in the process of going too far, delve into basically conspiracy theories. I mean, there were people who were like, Christianity was invented in the 4th century by the Pope and the Masons. Well, how'd you get a Pope? How'd you get a Pope pre-Christianity?
You mentioned Masons, and you're already off the rails. Right?
and yet, I challenge you to pick up a book from a handful of mythicists that does not go there.
Oh my goodness! Okay,
not all, but some. Anyway, I feel like we've gotten kind of far afield, but hopefully that was clarifying a little bit, Jason. I appreciate the call.
Okay, thank you much.
Thank you.
All right. We have Tracy in California. Thanks for waiting.
Well, hello, Matt and Don. How are you guys today?
We're great. It's nice to hear your voice.
Awesome.
What do you got?
Thank you. Well, today what I've got, I'm actually a little under the weather, but when I saw you two were on, I had to call.
All right.
Okay.
So,
we can't catch it over the phone, right?
Thank goodness, because you don't want it. Right. Trust and believe. I have been down for the past 3 days. Okay. So I have kind of a fun, lighthearted question today. I know there isn't a one-size-fits-all for atheists when it comes to celebrating Christmas, but I'm curious, how do you guys celebrate Christmas? And before you answer, I'm one of these Christmas